So when I first open PioSolver, I get this blank screen, and there's really not a lot I can do here without a tree loaded or on this particular tab. A couple things to just call out here is that one, I can look up at the menu bar here and the header and see what version of Pio Viewer that I'm on, and this is the latest version. So as of today, which is the beginning of December in 2021, I'm on version 2.0.7.5. I also can see at the bottom here if I'm actually connected to the solver, because again, as I've mentioned here, the viewer and the solver are actually separate. The viewer is just an interface that connects to the solver. I can see if I am connected to the solver here, and we'll show in a later video how I can actually either connect or disconnect to the solver in any given instance. I also again see the instance of PioSolver that I'm on, as well as when this was last updated. So the last update was on November 23rd, 2021. We're going to start in this video by looking at this post-flop tree building and calculations tab, and I know it's the second tab on the list of tabs in the videos that we have. I'm going to use that, and it's going to make sense in a second as to why we start with that tab as opposed to this first tab going left to right, the browser tab. So the browser tab is going to be where a lot of the outputs are found, and we'll cover that in a lot of detail. But again, when there's not a tree loaded, there's really not a lot I can do. So if I'm starting with a blank canvas and I'm trying to build a tree from scratch, I would always have to start with this post-flop tree building and calculations tab, because this is where all of that information is going to be, we're going to enter. This is where we enter all of the inputs of a solve in order to kind of see what those outputs actually look like. But I'll go back to this browser tab, because when I also open up a tree, so I'm just going to open up a random tree that we have here, and I have kind of a recently used tree. Whenever I open up a tree, it's going to default and open up into the tree building and calculations tab anyways. So as I've alluded to, the graphical user interface of PioSolver is called Pio Viewer, and it's broken up into 4 main screens, each one of those accessible by the 4 tabs. And we're going to start here on this first tab, on this post-flop tree building and calculations tab within this video. Now, this tab is where all of the inputs are entered, and which is why really at the end of the day, I'm not necessarily sure why it's second, and the browser where you would look at the outputs is first, but that's neither here nor there, and that's just a small UI thing. On this tab, though, this is where you can you're going to enter all of your inputs, you're going to build your game tree, and ultimately execute the solution. So in this video, I'm going to walk through all of the things that can actually be found on this tab and what you might use each of these different things for. And we're going to start with something fairly robust here, and we're going to look at ranges. So this first section here, in this box that this suite here, these 2 boxes, is where you would enter your ranges. And the 2 boxes here represent the 2 players that you wish to study within this analysis. Now, Pio, as you can gather from this, is limited to a heads-up poker hand and not multi-way. So, if you are looking for a solver that's going to help solve multi-way solutions, there are commercial options that are out there, and I'll cover those in upcoming videos in future releases if necessary, if I haven't done so at the launch of this course. But Pio can really only focus on heads-up scenarios. Now, within these ranges, the box on the left is going to represent the out-of-position player, and the box on the right is going to represent the in-position player. And to populate each of these ranges, you can see that since I loaded a tree, they're already populated, but if I started with a blank tree, these would be just blank, and I could enter them from scratch. Now, when I do want to populate those ranges, I can go click one of the boxes, and I'm going to actually go and click the in-position player. And what you're going to see is, in this situation here, a different window opens up. And I'll move this over here so we can actually see this next to the overall ranges. So you can see the shape of the in-position player's range by looking at this smaller window, but when I click on the in-position player's range, it opens up in a lot more detail in a separate window. And this is really where you're going to be entering all of your ranges. So there's a lot you can do here, and I want to actually take a little bit of time on this section and really go through the various options within this interface. The first thing that we see is a grid. And this is the grid that we've talked about in Module 1 that's just honestly become synonymous with solvers. It's part of my logo. The background of my logo is kind of mimicking a grid, right? And it's the view that you're probably most familiar with when you think of how ranges are displayed from a solver standpoint. The grid is broken up into a 13 by 13 set of individual boxes, and each of those individual boxes are representing each of the 169 distinct hands that you can be dealt with at the start of a Texas Hold'em hand. I'll go over how this is organized here. You can picture that one card in the 2-card hand represents the columns, and the other card represents the rows. And all of these boxes are ordered from ace all the way down to the last box, which is 2 over in the columns, and then the same thing with the rows. It's going from ace all the way down to 2. The top left box is 1-1, which represents aces. The next one would represent ace king, which is ace king, and all of these in the top row would be ace something, right? And so aces, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, ace 10. And then the same thing with rows. The left represents aces, and then as we kind of work your way down, you'll have aces, ace king, ace queen, ace jack, and so on and so forth. So as we kind of work our way through, you can see that everything from aces all the way to deuces and all the combinations in between are represented by this 13 by 13 grid. The hands that run down the diagonal, which I mentioned in Module 1, represent pocket pairs, right? So this first box, 1-1, is representing ace-ace. This box right here, 2-2, represents king-king. This box 3-3 here represents queen-queen, and so on and so forth, all the way down to 13-13, which represents 2-2. There's also a bit of symmetry in this range. So, after we remove out the 13 pocket pairs, there are 156 unique hands that are left. And those 156 unique hands are broken up into 2 sets of 78 hands that mirror one another. The upper side, or the hands that are above this diagonal, represent the 78 suited hands that we could have. So all of these hands above the diagonal here are all of the suited hands, and they're going to represent the hands where both cards share the same suit. Whereas the bottom left of the diagonal are representing the offsuit hands. So these are going to be the hands where the 2 cards that are within that pair, or that set, represent different suits, and they're the offsuit variety. So now I'm going to show you how you can actually interact with this grid itself. First and foremost, it's fairly simple. I can actually click any one of these boxes, and what you'll see is by clicking any one of these boxes, it adds that particular hand to a range. I can also hold down the mouse on a click and drag my mouse through, and it will click multiple boxes at once, which is quite helpful when I want to add multiple hands quickly. Just like I can click to add hands to a range, I can also click on a hand that is already added to a range and remove it from the range. And I can do that. It has the same functionality in the sense that I can click once and let go, or I can click and hold on it, and as I drag through, it will remove those hands from the range. The great thing about this is that it will always stay within the same thing in which you're trying to do. So if I'm trying to add hands to a range, I can click and hold, and as I'm going through, I can continue to add hands to a range, but if I go back over hands that I've already added, it's not going to remove them. Similarly, if I want to remove hands from range, once I click and remove and hold, as I drag through, I can remove the hands that I want from the range, but as I go over some of these hands that aren't in the range, it's not going to add hands to a range. So the function stays consistent once I actually click those hands down. I can also add specific suits to a range. So if you look here up in the top right, you'll see individual suits that are in a hand. Suppose that I only want to add club hands to a range. I can click a club first, and what you'll notice here is that the grid changes, and now it's showing hands that contain a club. I've changed a club to the first club, and now it's only showing club hands within my overall range. It actually also shows club hands in the offsuit variety, and the way it's looking at that is all of these hands, the very first card that's selected is a club, whereas the second card, it doesn't necessarily matter as much. And that's the notation here of, Queen of Clubs 7X. That really just refers to all of the hands that have a Queen of Clubs, but any 7. The 7 doesn't necessarily matter here. So if I actually add one of these hands to the range, so suppose I want to add 9-2 of clubs to this range, and I can add that here. It's going to say 1 here on the box, and when I unclick this though, now you can actually see that I actually don't have all of the 9-2 suited varieties in the hand. I only have 0.25% of the 9-2 suited hand varieties in the range, and that's referenced here by when I look at the combinations in the bottom right, which I'll introduce that a little bit more in a second. The 9-2 clubs is populated, whereas the other values are not populated. But I'll remove that right now, and we can kind of go through this in a little bit more detail, and we'll get to the individual combination section as well too. The one piece I'll add here to this is by doing this and using some of these suits, it allows me to add a little bit of nuance to the range and fairly quickly add individual combinations as opposed to adding things at the overall hand level. Because, as we've covered in the first set of videos, sometimes we want to look at things at the context of the overall hand level, but sometimes we actually want to drill down into an individual combination level and look at things that way. I really wouldn't recommend getting that specific when you're looking at pre-flop ranges, but this is very, very relevant when we get into post-flop spots. And, sometimes that, because of a flush draw or backdoor flush draw, you or your opponent might have some disguised hands, but only the hands that include a particular suit. That's when I can start getting into those individual combination levels and looking over the individual combinations in the bottom right. So the way to read a lot of this, and as you've kind of gathered probably from seeing how I'm scrolling through the screen, is that there are weights to all of these hands. So a lot of these are shaded fully yellow here, and they're going to have this number here in the bottom right of the grid that says, or the box that says 1. And what that means is that every single time that your opponent here, or this position here, this in-position player here, could have had aces in this pre-flop spot, it will always be in their range. They will never take a different action with aces, so aces will always be in their range. You're going to see other times where we might have a certain weighting here, which, again, I've covered this in the first module, but just to reintroduce this, there are some other hands where, in this case, King 8 offsuit will be in that player's range 72.4% of the time. So 72.4% of the time that they could have had King 8 offsuit in their offsuit range, in their range here pre-flop, they're going to open that with a raise, whereas the other 27.6% of the time they're not going to have that in their range. Presumably here they're going to be folding that pre-flop, which allows you to kind of put some more precision into your estimates of pre-flop ranges. And then you also kind of gathered that from when I added this clubs here and added the 9-2 suited and then unclicked here, you can see that by only adding the club value of the hands right here, the 9-2 suited is added, and that's a 1 at the combination level. but the other ones have zeros, right? And the shading is gray because we haven't added 9-2 of spades, 9-2 of diamonds, 9-2 of hearts. So it's fully present as 9-2 of clubs, but when I roll things up to the overall hand level, it's only one of the 4 suited hands that I'm including in the range, in which case the overall weighting of that hand in the entire range is 0.25. That 25% representing the quarter of the time that the combo is clubs. The other 3/4 of the time it will be hearts, spades, or diamonds, in which case we're not including that in the range. So, and we can do this at any level of granularity too. So suppose I actually wanted to just throw in the clubs and see 9-2 offsuit here. And again, 9-2 offsuit here, I have 3 versions of 9 of clubs, 2 of X, right? So I, down in my combination windows here, I can see 9 of clubs, 2 of spades, 9 of clubs, 2 of hearts, 9 of clubs, 2 of diamonds, and all 3 of those are fully populated. But when I remove the clubs from this window, now you can see it's still back to 0.25 because these 9-2 offsuits are included, these 3 9-2 offsuits, but there are 12 different offsuit varieties or 12 different ways to make an offsuit hand. So all of these other 9-2 offsuits are not populated in here. So again, it's only bringing a quarter of those in here. There's a simple way this is a simple way to quickly add a bunch of hands to your range when you only want to include the ones that contain particular cards. And again, as I mentioned here, it happens generally post-flop and generally when you're looking at boards with flush draws or backdoor flush draws, as I mentioned. The top right section here has a slider here that and a weight label. And I've introduced a little bit how we can potentially weight some hands here. That just essentially means that we can add in that precision to the overall set of hands that we actually have. A good way to understand this, though, is that assigning a player a range will always include those hands, and the range will the solver will only look at this range that you've actually included here. So this range will always include ace-4 offsuit, but it will virtually never include ace-3 offsuit in the similar situation. And if we're looking at things from a binary perspective and a better example is it will always include ace-4 offsuit, but it will never include king-4 offsuit because this is 1, this is 0. But that binary selection, it restricts us sometimes from adding a bit of nuance. And the weight functionality can allow us and give us, let us give partial weight to a particular hand. Now I can do that a couple different ways. One, I can use the slider. So you can see here that this box here that we have it's weighted at 1. I can slide this down here by clicking and holding on to and get to 0.5. And now whenever I click on anything, it's going to give me half of those combos. So rather than assigning every single combo to this range, maybe I'm not necessarily sure if this player is going to play a certain hand or not, and I want to hedge against the possibility that they might play it, they might not play it sometimes. I may give a weighting of 50% or 25% if I'm less confident, or 75% if I'm more confident, or really anywhere in between. But that weight functionality lets us give partial weight to a hand. So I can use the slider, or I can actually highlight this and enter it into the box. So let's say I just enter and I want to go 0.75. And now I can select these, and now I'm giving these hands 0.75 frequency. And you can mix and match weightings throughout, as you can see in the grid. And as you can see and probably guess, it's going to be particularly useful. So not because necessarily anyone's mixing or doing things like that. I really don't expect most players to be that calibrated enough to have a range that's so precise. I mean, some of the best players are going to have that, but the overwhelming majority of players aren't going to be as precise as that to say, well, we're only going to play this hand 50% of the time or 75% of the time. But what this does allow us to do, and this is important through data analysis, is it allows us to factor in uncertainty into our inputs, and which I'll cover in much more detail in Module 3 when we get into entering ranges, particularly when we're talking about blending. So let me remove this out, and so we remove these out, and we can also add ranges here by using this bottom box here below. There's a few options here. The most basic is the text box that we have here. I can add hands to a range, and you're going to see a lot of syntax down here. Pio is generally pretty good at accepting syntax. So you could type a range, you could paste a range in here, you could put a % in here. So, and I'll show you a few examples of this right now. So suppose I want to just change this and add in a range of just ace king. Well, if I just enter ace king, the solver is going to populate just ace king, both the offsuit or ends the suited varieties. And all of these things that I'm going to add in here, I could just separate by commas. I can add in an individual hand. So suppose I want to add in aces. I just type in AA and I can add in aces. Suppose I want to add in a range, right? So maybe I want to add in all of the hands between pocket nines and pocket deuces. I can do that by throwing in my comma and then typing in 99-22. And you'll see here now that all of these values between nines and deuces have been populated. Maybe I only want to add just a suited variety or offsuit variety. So I can add ace queen suited by adding AQS. So you'll see I first added ace queen, and both the ace queen and ace queen offsuit were populated. But then by adding the S, it only populates the suited variety. Same thing here if I want to do the offsuit side. So maybe I want to add queen 5 offsuit. I can go queen 5, and you'll see both of these get populated. But then when I add the O, it removes the suited variety here. I can add ranges of hands that aren't pairs as well too. So suppose I want to add all of the hands between ace jack offsuit and ace 6 offsuit. Well, here I would just go ace jack off dash ace 6 off. And you'll see now that it added all of the hands straight from ace jack off to ace 6 off. Now the syntax here is you have to keep the first card of the range constant. So if I want to do the same thing and add jack 7 off to ace to 8-7 off, I wouldn't be able to do that through this syntax. So if I add jack 7, actually I'll go jack 7 suited dash 8-7 suited, you see nothing really pops up. And that's because I have to actually keep the first card constant. So I could go jack 7 suited to jack 2 suited, and it will populate that set entirely. But I can't go down this way. So the only way I can actually do this is keeping the first card constant and then working my way as the second card from first to last. And then finally, I can add some weighted values directly into here too. So maybe I want to add king 6 suited, but I only want to add it for 50% of the combos. So what I would do is I would add a colon, and then I would add 0.5. And you'll see here now that my king 6 suited is added for 0.5. And I guess the last thing I can also do here is I could go down to the individual combination level too. So I could go and say, maybe I only want to add 8-5 of hearts. Well, in this case here, I would just go 8 of hearts, 5 of hearts, and you'll see the 8-5 of hearts is populated here when I hover over the combinations, but the 8-5 of spades, diamonds, and clubs are not populated. So let me cancel this out so we don't overwrite our range, and I'll reopen it again. So it gives us back the full range of our in-position player that we actually want to work with here. The other thing I can do here is I can actually put a percentage range here. Now this is a cool way, I think, of actually just entering, if you don't necessarily have a good sense of overall ranges and you want to just start with an overall estimate. So you might say that an opponent has maybe a quarter of his or her hands. What I can do here, if I know that's the case, then I want to enter maybe a quarter of those hands, but I don't necessarily know what range to enter, I can just enter within this text box 25%, And Pio is going to create a range here that's going to include, in this case here, 331.5 combos, which happens to be exactly 25% of overall hands. It's definitely a good approximation if you have some frequencies to work with. So maybe you are an online player and you have a HUD, and you can kind of see how many hands a certain player raises first in from a particular position, and you have enough of a sample size that you can kind of estimate there, but you don't necessarily know which particular hands he or she might have. This is a good way to kind of estimate what that overall range would look like. You can use this text box to enter, but you can also use this slider here. So by pulling things up and down, you can see the percentage that's changing here in this bottom right. So, right now it's at 26%. As I continue to add more hands into the range, you can see them populating in the grid, but you can also see that percentage going up and down as I'm moving the slider from left to right. Or you can use the plus or minus button. So this is the minus button, this is the plus button. I can start adding hands one by one. It probably actually segues us nicely into the next point that I want to make here, which is that there's this text here, which is button steal. And there's this box here up on the left-hand side of the screen, which is pre-flop hand orders. So as I push the button, every time I push one, it adds a hand into the overall range. And the question you might have is well, how is Pio determining what order in which we are adding hands? And Pio has a few different standard things that they've added in here. So they have a 3-bet call range, hand order rankings, a button steal hand order rankings, a default hand order rankings. You can actually use any of these rankings that are in here. And if I click one of these, so maybe I want to use the default ranking, you'll see down here the ranking that Pio uses changes. And now I just click the plus button and you'll see a bunch of different things happen. And that's because Pio changed the way in which it's categorizing hands. This is, again, a really, really cool way of adding hands. Pio has a few different options you can do. You can also I have my own little test one that I have here. You can go in and edit those. They're in the Pio directory. They're stored as text files. I'll pull up the Pio directory here for you here. There's hand orders, this hand order files. You could see each of these 4 files, and I can open up any one of these. So maybe I open up the default and I'll pull it over, and it's simply just a text file that shows the order of all of the hands within that Pio is ordering the hands from best hand to worst hand. So if you're wondering how Pio does that, or how they're actually denoting what's the best hand, what's the second best hand, what's the third best hand, it's within that Pio directory. It's stored as a text file, and it's really nothing more than a text file with those 169 hands in order. So if you have your own way of ranking, and if you can come up with any ranking of your own, you can type it out and save it in that folder, and it'll appear in this window right here when you actually open Pio, and you can use that on your own to really phase up and phase down hands by an overall percentage of the overall entire range.